Good morning, and welcome to the fourth webinar in our series about the Bead challenge process. I'm Laura Sasaki. I am a program and project supervisor over here at the California Public Utilities Commission in the Bead branch. We thank you for joining us this morning and appreciate your engagement in the challenge process. So previously we presented to you an overview of the model challenge process and highlighted the key differences between that and then the approved challenge process that will be used in California. So today we're going to explain how permissible challengers, and that is local governments, tribal governments, nonprofits, and in some cases broadband service providers, can help gather information from individuals and submit those challenges on their behalf. We'll also supply permissible challengers with a toolkit for outreach in the community, and we'll talk about that. And that will contain materials like slides, flyers, and videos explaining how to submit individual evidence. And this webinar will also reference those materials, but we're not going to be able to include all of it because we will start releasing toolkit materials later this week, and then we will continue to add to it in the coming weeks. Additionally, this webinar is specifically tailored for local and tribal governments and nonprofits, but anyone is welcome to join today. So we also wanted to acknowledge those who took time to submit questions in advance. Please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A today, and we'll be posting the answers on the website after this session. So today we're pleased to have with us Joanne Hovis, president of CTC. CTC serves as one of the CPUC's key contractors and partners in developing the Bead program. And we're also pleased to have Clayton Woolley with us, director of technical strategy for Ready.net, who is the CPUC's partner in developing the challenge portal. I'll hand it over to Joanne and she can take it from here.
Thank you, Laura. And just to confirm, are you hearing me all right?
Yes, I am.
Thanks, great. Many thanks, Laura. Hello, everyone. I am delighted to be here today to present this information on how to accept individual challenges. Let me start today by introducing our agenda. As you all know, this is an extraordinarily important and unprecedented time for broadband planning. The Bead program is a unique, extraordinary, and first and probably last of its kind funding program coming from the federal government. The CPUC, which is executing the Bead program for the state of California, is committed to transparency and frequent communications during execution of the Bead planning process to ensure full participation and, of course, the greatest impact on broadband coverage in California. The goal of the program is to get funding to the areas of the state that need it the most. While many of you have attended previous webinars offered by the CPUC regarding the Bead program, we're going to begin this webinar by reviewing the basics of the program, providing an overview of the challenge process as it's been approved by the CPUC, and discussing all of this background material. Some of these principles will be familiar to you already. But a refresher is always valuable, and we hope to be able to clear up any questions that you might have. Then we're going to get into the mechanics of how you, as an eligible challenger, can submit challenges and also aggregate challenges from residents in your community so as to benefit from data and information and insights that they have. First, let's start with some housekeeping items. We have some reminders and tips to help you get the most out of today's webinar. Please use side-by-side speaker mode under view options, English closed captions, which you can access by selecting Show Captions in your Zoom toolbar. If you have any questions, please submit them using the Q&A function on Zoom. You can submit questions and also view other attendees' questions. If someone else posts a question that you also have, please upvote it so that we know that it's a popular and important question. While we won't be able to answer your questions live during this meeting, we make note of all of them and answers will be added to the FAQs on the CPUC's Bead Challenge process webpage. Please also keep an eye on the chat as we'll be posting helpful links throughout today's webinar. A final note, this webinar, like the others, is being recorded and will be posted on the CPUC website for asynchronous review of all of the information provided. Now that we've dispensed with all the housekeeping items, we can dive into the substance of today's webinar. Let me start with a question of who should be involved in this. Today, as Laura said, we're providing details for local governments, tribal governments, and nonprofits who wish to submit challenges on behalf of individuals. Based on federal rules, these are the only entities that are allowed to submit challenges. But these entities are able to aggregate multiple challenges coming from individual residents, data coming from members of the community, and submit those on behalf of the community. When registering as a permissible challenger, to do this, you must select the option to submit challenges on an individual's behalf. Please note that broadband service providers are also permissible challenges, but they will not be able to submit or aggregate these individual challenges coming from individual members of the community. That will be limited to local governments, tribal governments, and nonprofits who wish to do so. Now, why is this so important? As we've talked about in previous Bead webinars, the Bead Challenge process is the single best opportunity to improve on and contest the accuracy of the FCC's National Broadband Map. Once the challenge process that is being conducted by the CPUC is over, and once NTIA has approved the outcome of that challenge process, that is to say, all of the locations that are eligible for the BEAD funding program, there will be no other opportunity to make changes for BEAD infrastructure funding eligibility. What that means is that this once-in-a-lifetime funding opportunity of $1.86 billion going out to build last-mile infrastructure in California will be based on the outcome of this challenge process. And that is why the stakes are so high and the importance of participating in the challenge process is so critical. It facilitates the needs of your community, and it facilitates the goal of the BEAD program to provide high-speed internet service to all eligible locations, those locations being determined through this challenge process. Now, let's review the BEAD program in general. An overview of BEAD starts with what the BEAD program is and what its funding priorities are. And I know many of you have heard this before and already know this information, but we are going to just lay out the basics here so that everyone has the same grounding for the more detailed conversation that's coming in just a few minutes. A little background on the process for California. The document that outlines California's approach to the BEAD challenge process is known as the Initial Proposal Volume 1. That is all the rules that were established by the state of California for the challenge process under federal requirements. That document, Initial Proposal Volume 1, was approved by NTIA, the oversight entity within the federal government, in April, and then it was approved by the CPUC, the commission, on May 9th. We understand that you are all anxious to know more about specific dates for the challenge process, but we can't nail them down until a couple more milestones are completed, including certain kinds of approvals that have to come from the federal government. Now, the challenge process, which is obviously what we're talking about in such detail in this webinar and others in the current timeline, is part of the BEAD program. And BEAD, of course, stands for the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program that was created by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, known as the IIJA, or as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, created in 2021. Under the IIJA, BEAD has $42.45 billion in federal funds for broadband, and it's administered by NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, which is an administration of the U.S. Department of Commerce. That is the entity that sets the requirements and phases of the programs, and the CPUC submits its proposal documents for how it plans that California will use its share of the BEAD funds to NTIA, with the initial proposal, Volume 1, being the CPUC's plan for the challenge process, and the initial proposal, Volume 2, being the CPUC's plan for how it'll administer the grant program itself for BEAD to give away the funds based on the eligible locations that come out of the challenge process. BEAD's overall goal, as established by Congress, is expanding high-speed internet access through deployment of new infrastructure. And the primary use of BEAD funds will be infrastructure projects to build infrastructure and service to unserved and underserved locations. There are three primary priorities for BEAD funding as established by Congress, and they're listed here in order. The first, of course, is unserved areas, which are defined in the statute as locations with internet speeds that are below 25 megabits in the downstream direction and 3 megabits in the upstream direction. The second priority is underserved areas or underserved locations, which are defined in the statute as those locations that have internet service of 25 by 3 or up, but below 100 megabits in the downstream direction, 20 in the upstream direction. So between 25 by 3 and 100 by 20 is underserved. Below 25 by 3 is unserved. The underserved locations will receive funding as a second priority after unserved locations have been taken care of. Finally, under the statute, if there are funds left over after connecting unserved and underserved locations, then additional funding can be used to connect community anchor institutions that don't currently have access to internet service of a symmetrical gigabit per second or more. And community anchor institutions, in federal jargon known as CAIs, are institutions such as schools, hospitals, community centers, libraries, and so on, where those faster speeds of a gigabit symmetrical or more are important for being able to serve large segments of the community. Under the BEAD rules, NTIA uses the FCC's map, the National Broadband Map, which is based on the FCC's broadband data collection efforts, to determine whether locations qualify as served, unserved, or underserved. NTIA will use that map as a starting point to determine what locations are eligible for BEAD. And that map is based on reporting by broadband service providers to the FCC. The challenge process represents the state of California's opportunity to correct anything in that map that might be incorrect through the challenge process. The BEAD program has very clear federal rules and requirements, and all states, including California, are obligated to follow NTIA's requirements for the BEAD program in order to have access to these funds. California was allocated $1.86 billion of the BEAD funds, and those funds will be available once the CPUC has completed the sequence of federally required plans and proposals that are mandated in order to unlock the BEAD funds that were appropriated in the IIJA. The planning cycle for BEAD is well underway. Most of it took place in 2023. And in the middle of this year, the CPUC will run the challenge process. And then we'll follow it with what's called the subgrantee selection process, meaning the grant program that will actually determine where funds are awarded for particular projects that will serve unserved and underserved locations. We don't have exact dates on the challenge process or the grant program yet, but as soon as those are available, they will obviously be shared. And then we anticipate that actual deployment of the infrastructure that will be funded through the BEAD program will begin in 2025. Let's talk about the BEAD challenge process itself. Critically, let's start with the purpose of the challenge process, which, as I said a few minutes ago, is this really extraordinary and incredibly important opportunity to make sure that the map is right and to improve on the FCC's map. Because the BEAD program is intended to bring high-speed internet to unserved and underserved locations, this critical first step involves identifying and confirming which locations actually are unserved or underserved. So the challenge process provides a mechanism for eligible challengers to provide data to improve on and update the map, the FCC map, to establish which locations should be BEAD eligible. And that includes locations that are considered unserved, locations that are considered underserved, and community anchor institutions that are unserved with that symmetrical gigabit that we were talking about just a couple of minutes ago. So what the challenge process does is it allows eligible challengers the opportunity to offer input on whether locations have been accurately reported in the FCC data and whether they should be eligible for BEAD funding or not. Keep in mind that this really is a unique and singular process in that it enables the state to improve on the FCC's map using rules developed by the state under NTIA guidelines rather than just having to accept the FCC's determinations. That is what's so unique about this process, is that it starts with the FCC map, but it allows for local provision of data and state determinations about which locations should be eligible for BEAD funding. Well, why is that so important? As we talked about just a few minutes ago, it allows you, if you're an eligible challenger, a local government, a tribal government, a nonprofit, or a broadband service provider, to help update the data that will determine which locations are eligible for BEAD funding before that goes to be approved by NTIA. If data on the map are currently inaccurate, you are in a position as an eligible challenger to submit evidence to update the map, to improve on the map. It is our only remaining chance for BEAD purposes to correct map data that may be inaccurate and develop the best possible eligibility map for BEAD funding. That challenge process is, as a result, necessary to determine BEAD eligibility and to achieve the BEAD program's goal of getting reliable high-speed internet service to all locations throughout the state, throughout the country. As such, participating in the challenge process, which will enable you to improve the data about your community, is a way for you to advocate for the appropriate funding and the effective infrastructure projects to serve the folks in your community who need it. Let's talk about the timeline with the challenge process. And what you see here is a timeline that covers the sequence of activities in the challenge process as established by the initial proposal, Volume 1, that was approved by the Commission a couple of weeks ago, as I mentioned earlier. A list of the eligible locations for the challenge process will be published at least 7 days before the challenge phase begins. Then the challenge phase will begin, and permissible challengers will have 30 days to submit challenges and the evidence to support their challenges. At the end of the 30 days of the challenge phase, there will be a 14-day review period that will allow the CPUC time to review the evidence that was provided with the challenges. At that point, the rebuttal phase will begin. For every challenge that is submitted with acceptable evidence, a service provider or other rebutter will have the opportunity to provide counter evidence to rebut the challenge and claim that the original data is in fact accurate. They will have to provide evidence of that rebuttal, and they will have 30 days during the rebuttal phase to do that. After the rebuttal phase, the CPUC will have another 30 days to review the challenges, review the rebuttals, evaluate the evidence, and issue a final determination in the form of a final list of eligible locations, that is to say Bead eligible locations, based on the rules of the process and the eligibility established by the IIJA. The final list will then be submitted by the CPUC to NTIA. Based on NTIA's rules, that happens when the challenge process is done, and NTIA then has the opportunity to review and then approve the list of eligible locations, requesting changes or clarifications where necessary. And at that point, the final list will be released publicly. Let's talk about who can submit a challenge in the challenge process. And what we have here are the federal rules as established by NTIA for who is an eligible challenger or a permissible challenger under the rules developed at the federal level. Local governments, tribal governments, nonprofit organizations, and broadband service providers are the four categories of permissible challengers. Now, individual households, residents, businesses, etc., are not eligible to submit challenges directly under NTIA's rules, but California residents can still play an important role in the challenge process. They can identify inaccuracies in the map, and then they can work with eligible challengers, that is to say, local governments, tribal governments, and nonprofits, to provide evidence and challenge the maps in order to prove the map to the greatest degree possible. Residents of California will be able to upload evidence using a publicly available webpage that will then enable the permissible challenges, tribal governments, local governments, and nonprofits, to submit that evidence on their behalf. This webinar is going to explain what this process looks like and how permissible challengers can help individuals to participate in the challenge process. The CPUC will also begin publishing a toolkit of resources this week and continue to add to it in the coming weeks. And that toolkit will provide resources for challengers such as tribal governments, local governments, and nonprofits to work with individuals and to facilitate their participation in the challenge process. Now let's get into some more details involving the challenge process. First, let's focus on the types of data that qualify as a challenge. The aspects of service that can be challenged are internet speeds and other specifications, which we'll show on the following slides to determine Bead eligibility. So that's the core and first item, right? Internet speeds and other specifications of the service. Next, identification of a community anchor institution or a challenge to the eligibility of a community anchor institution in the data set. Next, identifying or challenging enforceable commitments for specific locations. And finally, identifying planned service for specific locations. Let's start with specific challenge types now. Availability. This is a challenge that shows that high-speed internet is not available at a specific location. Speed shows that the speeds available at that location are below the requirements of what is considered served or underserved. Latency, showing that service latency at a particular location exceeds a certain number and is thus higher than what is specified by NTIA as being acceptable for broadband service. A data cap showing that the plan offered at that location has an unreasonable data restriction. Technology, showing that the technology that connects a certain location is inaccurately reported on the map. And business service only, showing that only business service is offered at a location where it might be reported as more expansive than that. An enforceable commitment, which is a showing that a location will be served because a broadband service provider has an enforceable commitment to do so, meaning an enforceable commitment in some kind of contract to build broadband to that location and offer it at that location, and that location is therefore served through an enforceable commitment. And plan service showing that there is a plan for a location to have service by the end of June 2024, meaning that it is effectively served for purposes of need. Next, not part of an enforceable commitment, showing that a location is actually not bound through an enforceable commitment to be served and should thus be considered unserved. Location is a community anchor institution, a showing that a location should be designated as a community anchor institution or a CAI. And finally, the inverse, that a location is not a CAI, showing that a location should not be designated as a community anchor institution, but rather as a regular address. These are the various forms of challenges, the specific challenge types that are part of the process. There are two special kinds of challenges that are built into the California plan for the challenge process. And these two special types are known as the area challenge and the MDU challenge. If a certain number of challenges are submitted in a particular area or an MDU, a multi-dwelling unit, then under the rules established, the service provider has the burden of proof to show that all the locations in that entire area are served. So, for example, in a given census block group, if 6 or more locations served by the same provider are challenged through the challenge process, then the broadband service provider in the rebuttal phase must submit evidence that proves that the locations in the entire census block group are served, even those locations that did not submit a challenge. That is the area challenge framework, that by submitting a challenge with evidence that 6 or more locations served by the same provider in a census block group are not actually served, the provider, in order to rebut that, must submit evidence to prove that all of the locations in that entire census block group are served. Likewise, for a challenge for an MDU or a multi-dwelling unit, if a large MDU has at least 3 units that submit a challenge with evidence, then the internet service provider serving that MDU in the rebuttal must submit evidence to prove that all of the units, even the ones that didn't submit a challenge, are served. This approach, the area and MDU challenge approach, applies for availability, speed, latency, data cap, and technology challenges. And the broadband service provider's rebuttal must meet evidentiary standards for the area or the multi-dwelling unit, which is different depending on the type of challenge. The details of these challenge types can be found in the NTIA policy notice on this topic, as well as in the CPUC's initial proposal, Volume 1, that document I mentioned earlier that will govern the entirety of the challenge process as approved by the Commission. Now, let's move on to the purpose of our webinar today, which is your role as a permissible challenger in the challenge process, and how you, as a permissible challenger, will be in a position, if you so choose, to submit challenges on behalf of individual residents. As I said earlier, permissible challengers under the NTIA rules include local governments, tribal governments, nonprofits, and broadband service providers. Only these entities will have access to the California Challenge Portal, which will be the mechanism for filing challenges and rebuttals, and only these entities will be able to submit or rebut challenges. While individuals won't be able to register for the challenge portal, we encourage you as a permissible challenger to engage with individual communities and collect their challenges and their evidence to submit through the portal, which will enable you to ensure that all necessary changes and the best possible changes are made to the map showing the locations that are eligible for BEAD funding. We also encourage you to help educate individuals about the types of challenges they can submit, and then to collect and aggregate all of those challenges within your community or your larger geographic area. In order to do this as a permissible challenger, you will need to register to submit challenges on behalf of individuals. When you register for the challenge portal, you will have the opportunity to check yes when you're asked if you would like to submit challenges on behalf of individuals. You will also be asked what geographic area you would like to receive individual submitted evidence for, and you'll have the opportunity to select a single county, multiple counties, or the entire state. This will determine what evidence submissions from individuals you'll be able to view in the portal. This is encouraged for a number of reasons that we'll talk about later, but for now, let me just say that selecting this option and being open to receiving evidence from individual residents will greatly amplify the impact of your participation in the challenge process, just because you're going to have a lot more data to submit from a widely distributed group of people within your community. You'll be in a position to empower individuals and just ensure that your community is more accurately represented in the data sets that will determine eligibility for BEAD funding. It is those individual residents who are the folks who are experiencing the impact of lack of broadband and the other access issues around broadband. And this whole process is designed to enable them to tell you if their address or neighborhood is unserved or underserved, and then for you to be able to submit those data through the challenge portal in order to ensure that the interests of your community are fully served. Here's some examples of challenges that you may submit or that you may submit on behalf of an individual or individuals. This is not an exhaustive list, and a challenger can submit challenges for any type of challenge, but these are just some illustrations. A speed challenge can be submitted for a specific location that the FCC map shows as served, but that has speeds that are under 25 by 3, as shown by approved speed tests. Availability challenges can demonstrate that a location that the FCC map shows as served is not actually served by a broadband service provider. The evidence could be, for example, a letter from the provider to the consumer denying a service request, a letter or an email. Each type of challenge has its own evidentiary requirements, and you can see the NTIA policy notice as well as the initial proposal, volume 1, for more information on each of those types of evidentiary requirements. Now we're going to move into discussions of the challenge portal and how you will engage with it as a challenger. And for this discussion, I'm going to turn it over to Clayton Woolley, the Director of Technical Strategy at Ready.net, which is the CPUC's partner and vendor for the challenge portal. And then in a few minutes, I'll pick it back up from him. Clay?
Awesome. Thank you, Joanne, and excited to be here this morning to spend some time with you all and walk through the challenge process. So let's jump right in. All right, so as we discussed previously, this is the registration page. So the link was dropped into the chat, and so when you go to the registration page, fill out the basic information. Enter in information about your organization, and then we encourage you to select yes to accept challenges and evidence on residential's behalf. After you register, you'll receive an email with confirmation that we have in fact received your registration, and then a further confirmation once we have accepted your registration. On to the next page, please. So one thing that we want to cover a little bit more in detail is the CostQuest Tier E fabric license. So we strongly recommend that you do apply for a Tier E CostQuest license, and that you do so sooner than later, because it does take some time for you to receive approval. The reason that we encourage this is because the portal is going to show you the location ID as well as the addresses. But because of the way that the licensing works, the only thing that we can export to you all is the location ID. So you will need a fabric license as well as the supporting data that comes along with it in order to do research on your own outside of the portal. There's some helpful links on this slide to walk you through that process. All right, so next we're going to focus on how to submit a challenge. So we'll also discuss how to submit a challenge on an individual's behalf, and those will show up at the bottom tab that says resident corrections. Both processes are important, but for the next little bit, we're going to focus on actually how you all gather evidence and submit a challenge. And so once you log in, which can be done using email and password or through a magic link, it'll bring you to this page here, and we're going to start on the challenges tab. So on the challenges tab, this is sort of your home base. It'll show you the different status of your challenges and evidence. And we're going to start by hitting the add challenge button, which will be on the top right of your dashboard. So that is going to bring us to the map view. So there's a couple of things that we want to take a look at here. So on the right side are the different challenge types that you're eligible to submit, and on the left side is where you can conduct analysis, including creating a zone. So we'll move on to the next step. So creating a zone is for really two reasons. One is analysis. So you can go in and select an area. There's a couple of different ways to select an area. You can draw directly on the map. You can upload a shapefile. So if you all use GIS, you can upload some of your own shapefiles for areas that you might have done your own research on. Or you can select from a library. And so the library includes shapefiles for cities, towns, counties, tribal boundaries, etc. And that's where you can hone in and do a little bit of research prior to submitting challenges. Next slide there. So then we're going to get into actually how you submit a challenge. There's a couple of different ways to get those locations in. As we discussed earlier, if you define different areas, you can upload those, and it'll upload all the points in the challenge. You can upload a list of CSVs. You can select individual points on the map, or you can shift and click if you haven't defined an area, but you do want to pull in more than one broadband serviceable location. Next slide, please. So the next bit is actually uploading the evidence. So with each different challenge type, you're going to be reminded again in the portal what type of evidence is required for what challenge. We do recommend that you've already have already conducted a lot of your research prior to getting to the steps, so you have it ready to go and upload for whatever the applicable challenge type is. And after you have clicked through all of those different screens, uploaded your evidence, entered in supporting evidence or documentation, the final bit is an attestation that the information that you're submitting is true and accurate to the best of your knowledge. So as we mentioned a minute ago, viewing the evidence from individuals, that's going to show up in your resident correction tab of your portal. And that's where you're going to get to see what the individual has uploaded. You'll have an opportunity to review what they've uploaded to make sure that it is accurate for the challenge type and has all of the required evidence. If that passes, you're able to submit that challenge on the individual's behalf, and it will enter into your dashboard. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk a little bit about rebuttals. There's a couple of areas that we'll cover briefly, but it's really just for the service providers. So if there's an availability type challenge, the service provider is the one that's being challenged there, and they have the opportunity to gather evidence and rebut. But another area that's going to affect everyone is a planned service or enforceable commitment. You can gather evidence and file there on those challenge types. And once a challenge is rebutted, CPUC will analyze the evidence and issue a final determination at the end of the challenge process. Thank you. Joanne, back to you.
Thank you, Clay. Now that we've gone over how you'll process challenges and evidence, let's go over what you can do to engage with those individual members of the public, to encourage and empower them to submit evidence for the challenge process. As we talked about earlier in this presentation, we're really encouraging you to engage with these individuals and review their evidence to submit challenges on their behalf. There are a number of reasons that there is benefit to engaging with these individual evidence submissions. For one, you'll expand the amount of evidence you can draw upon for challenges, which will improve the accuracy of the broadband data and quite frankly, just make more of your community, your area, eligible for BEAD funding by improving where there is inaccurate data about whether an area is unserved or not. This is also a way that you can empower the residents of the community you serve to make a change to the data and to get service where they need it. It's a way of advocating for your community and linking these individuals into the processes that will determine the infrastructure of the internet that comes into their communities. It also, frankly, will just entail promoting participation to your larger community to let individuals know that they can submit speed tests and other evidence to make their address eligible for funding for BEAD, for better broadband infrastructure. And it's going to involve collecting that evidence, submitting challenges on their behalf in the portal, as we outlined in the how-to section earlier. So here's what individual residents can do. These are the parts of the challenge process that you can invite them to participate in and work with them on. Individual residents can upload evidence to a publicly available site to make the evidence available to permissible challengers, such as yourself, who can then choose to submit that challenge to the CPUC on the individual's behalf. That evidence can include speed tests, availability evidence, and other evidence regarding provider service. Those individual members of the public, though, can't submit a challenge on their own to the CPUC. They can't register in the challenge portal, they can't rebut challenges, and they can't view challenge status in real time. But they obviously can be engaged in submitting evidence to you and enabling you to submit it on their behalf into the portal, thus more broadly representing their and the larger community's interests. And with regard to encouraging them to participate in this way and to submit that evidence to you, there are a number of ways that you may want to mobilize the community and effectively run an outreach campaign. You could do this in all the ways that you traditionally reach out to members of your community, including email, physical mail, phone calls, webinars, and otherwise. And in order to facilitate that, the CPUC will provide outreach materials to enable and to facilitate these kinds of campaigns that will allow you to inform the public. The outreach materials that the CPUC will make available are designed to set you up to be able to give individuals the information they need to participate in the program. And as we said before, those outreach materials, those toolkit materials, will be released some later this week and some next week. If you run these outreach campaigns, they should focus on the information that's relevant to members of the community about the challenge process, particularly how to conduct speed tests and how to provide those results to the permissible challenger that will be submitting the challenge. And the CPUC's Outreach Materials Toolkit will contain resources on all of these topics. As you can see, on the following slide, which is about what is actually in the toolkit that will be released over the course of the next couple of weeks. The toolkit, which is designed to help those individuals understand what they can do here and what options they have, will include customizable slides to conduct training sessions so that you can conduct training sessions for individuals in your communities. And those slides will go over what those individuals need to do in order to participate and how they can undertake each step of the process. There'll also be a video of a training session in case you would like to play a video for the public and not have to present the slides yourself, or do both. And there'll be a recording of this webinar and flyers and handouts with useful information that you can use to publicize the challenge process to the public. While the first parts of the toolkit will be published this week, there'll be materials added in coming weeks. Now, as I've said before, all challenges are subject to specific evidentiary requirements set by NTIA, and it's important that both you as an eligible challenger and the individuals who participate in the challenge process with you understand these standards. And the standards on this slide apply to all challenge types. First, the address provided for the challenge must be what the federal government calls a broadband serviceable location, or a BSL. And it must be found in the fabric, which is the term of art that the FCC uses for the data set that shows all of the locations throughout the country where fixed broadband is or could be deployed. So that is, the fabric is the data set that includes all of the BSLs, or broadband serviceable locations, where there either is already broadband or there should be broadband. Second, the challenge service must be on the national broadband map and must meet the definition of reliable broadband service, which means that it's served consistently by one of a certain set of technologies. So there has to be that somewhere on that map, there is a BSL that is shown shown as having service and that meets the definition of reliable broadband service that is then challenged. Third, the email address that is used to send the challenge must be verifiable and reachable so that it can be contacted by sending a confirmation message to that email address. And finally, if you use scanned images, the quality has to be good enough to allow for a program to turn the image back into text using optical character recognition, enabling the challenge to be processed. And then, of course, on top of this, the evidence must meet the standards of evidence for the challenge type and contain all the required information. And all of that information is, of course, in the initial proposal, Volume 1. Individual members of the public will be able to submit evidence for challenges under the provider service level type. These include availability, speed, latency, data cap, technology, and business service only that we talked about just a few minutes ago. With respect to individuals, the most common type of challenges are generally availability and speed. And the toolkit that the CPUC will shortly publish will explain these explicitly and detail the types of evidence that are acceptable. The important factors for you to remember as a permissible challenger are that as the registered challenger, when you process the evidence that is submitted by the individual or individuals for whom you are submitting evidence, you should review that evidence to ensure that all the information is provided in the way that is required by NTIA and by the initial proposal, Volume 1. Some of the things you might want to check are that all required information is represented. So for example, the IP address, the physical address, the service provider, the subscription tier. You may want to check to be sure that the median has been calculated correctly for the speed tests, and there'll be an explanation in some detail of how to do that in the toolkit. So in other words, that the speed test actually was calculated and met the evidentiary requirements. You may want to check that the resident subscribes to at least 100 by 20 if they are submitting a speed test. Stated otherwise, it's not adequate for them to submit to you and you to submit to the CPUC a speed test that shows a lower speed if they actually subscribe to a lower speed, because that means that they couldn't actually get 100 by 20 megabits per second because they don't pay for that particular service. You may want to check that each evidence file uploaded is the right one. We find that there are frequently mistakes when folks are uploading files. That's just inevitable. It's important to note that challenges with evidence that don't meet the CPUC's and NTIA standards can't be accepted, especially if those challenges have evidence that's inaccurate or provide insufficient documentation or details. So please also make sure that all evidence is submitted before the end of the challenge phase, which applies to your challenges as well as the challenges that you are collecting from individuals. The 30-day timeframe on the challenge phase is going to require quick action. Early submission is going to give you more time to potentially communicate with individual submitters and correct any errors you may have found in their submission. As I already noted, the customizable slides that we'll provide in the toolkit cover the evidentiary requirements in a way that is designed to be accessible for those individuals in your community who may want to submit evidence to you, challenges to you to submit through the challenge process. For your reference, please review the policy notice and other NTIA publications, as well as the initial proposal volume 1, so that you can know the evidentiary standards against which you should judge those submissions coming from members of the public. And as you'll recall, those evidentiary standards were also covered in our first webinar on the challenge process, which is also available on the challenge process website for the Bead program. The CPUC is very focused on transparency throughout the Bead process, so it plans to post all submitted challenges and rebuttals before the final determination is made. And the information that will be posted includes who submitted the challenge, the census block group of the challenge location, who the challenge party is, the type of challenge, and a summary of the challenge, including if a rebuttal was filed. Now, the CPUC is also committed to privacy, and it won't post any personally identifiable information about any individuals providing evidence. And now let me turn this back over to Laura to finish up today's content. Laura?
Thanks, Joanne. And also thank you to Clay for talking a little bit about what to expect in the portal. Just to reiterate what Joanne said, the big picture for this is that Bead is an incredibly unique opportunity for investment in broadband infrastructure. We talk about it being a once in a generation investment in the nation's broadband infrastructure, but we're talking about California. It is equally a once in a generation investment in California's broadband infrastructure. Its success will depend on the quality of the data that we are providing for broadband availability. And so your participation in the challenge process, both as a permissible challenger and as we talked about today, being able to facilitate individuals submitting challenges and doing that on their behalf, can guarantee that the data is accurate and identify those areas of concern. The challenge process can also influence what funding opportunities may look like after BEAD and where future efforts can be directed. Because again, remember that this is going to help inform those nationwide broadband maps that the federal government will use to determine where funding can go for future broadband programs. So just a reminder that we are continuing outreach and webinars. We do have this week, we have some office hours coming up. So this Thursday we have office hours. You can register and sign up for those at the same place that you registered to sign up for this webinar. You can sign up for one or all three at the same time to save you a little bit of time on registration. And that is intended to be a two-way bi-directional communication. So questions that you still have that are outstanding, please feel free to come to that with those, and we'll be engaging in conversation and kind of talking through those together. We also will be having a webinar for the challenge process for broadband service providers, specifically focusing on the rebuttal process, and that will be at a later date. We're still working on the date for that, but we will also be posting that on the event website. And just some takeaways on next steps and things that you can do based on the information that we talked about here today. So as we said, attending webinars, we will have additional webinars upcoming. Those will be posted on the events page as those are developed and registration becomes available. Sign up for office hours, come talk to us, ask some of the questions. We will answer what we can. That the questions that we still need to kind of hash out, we will let you know that. We'll be transparent about that. We would also ask that if you have not already, please pre-register to get access to the challenge portal. And when you do so, like we talked about today, select yes when given the option to submit challenges on behalf of residents. As we talked about earlier today, you can choose the entire state if you want to accept challenges from residents across the state, or you can select one county or multiple counties. Request a CostQuest license. Clay talked about that a little bit today. For the majority of attendees here today, you'll be looking at a Tier E license, which is for local governments, tribal governments, and nonprofits. If you're a service provider, you'd be looking at a Tier D license, and those links are also there. We'd love it if you would sign up for email updates and news. I think we have a lot of your contact information already, but if you haven't, you can do that on our website. And then we would also ask that you, to the extent that you are able, conduct some community outreach to promote participation, utilizing the toolkit that we talked about here today. So as Joanne mentioned, we will start posting that later this week and continue to add to it as we have more resources available for you. So if you have any questions, again, this is specific to the challenge portal. So if you're trying to sign up in there, if you're trying to register and you run into some issues, please email the help desk that Ready has available there. Again, that is for the challenge portal and for technical assistance with that. And then with general questions about the BEAD program that haven't been answered here today, please email us at the CPUC, which is bead@cpuc.ca.gov. And then we also have some additional resources that are posted online. And as we discussed earlier, on the events page where you signed up, you will also be able to find the PDFs of the presentations and also these recordings. So those will get posted probably within the next couple days. And so if there's something that we referred to here that was a little bit unfamiliar to you, you are welcome to go and find those recordings. You can buzz through and find the spot in there that you are looking for. That is available on the events page. The CPUC's BEAD page just has general program information, including the full approved IP volume 1. We also have a challenge process webpage that has just specific information on the challenge process. And then we are still working on getting the frequently asked questions up. We should have some of those prior to office hours on Thursday. So next slide, and that is a big thank you from all of us here at the California Public Utilities Commission. We thank you for being here with us today, for spending your morning with us, and we hope to see you at office hours later this week and look forward to hearing about some of your outreach activities. Thank you and have a wonderful day.